Right, welcome to the Downtown Den for our latest event. I'm delighted today to be joined by Mike Emmerich from Metro Dynamics and Jessica Bowles from Bruntwood. Both of them will tell you a little bit more about their respective companies and roles within the businesses as the conversation progresses. I could just welcome these two fabulous speakers by saying that they're the best double act that Downtown has. We compare them with Morecambe and Wise, but of course, a little less funny, but certainly entertaining in their own way. So good afternoon, guys. Great to see you.
Hello.
Hello.
And I know you're going to kick us off this time, Mike, in terms of giving us your thoughts and opinions on a variety of matters. But before we get into that, can you just explain your background and also what Metro Dynamics does?
So, well, first off, Frank, it's always lovely to do stuff because you always have interesting debates, and it's always nice to be doing things with Jessica as well. So, two for the price of one. So, we set up Metro Dynamics 5 years ago. I, at the time, was working for what was New Economy, now part of the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. We'd had the City Growth Commission, which was an idea I'd had, and then got Greater Manchester behind it. We then got the Core Cities and others to back, and a friend of mine that I've known for 30 years, Ben Lucas, was running it at the Core Cities at the RSA, and we agreed to once that report had come out, which said there should be more devolution to cities, and I at the time had been working with Howard Bernstein on the first couple of GM devolution deals. We decided that there was scope for a business that really specialised in place. That focus on economics, on strategy, on getting deals done, on getting political communications and strategic communications working, all with a view to trying to make cities work better. And because there's plenty of good technical people who do business cases and what have you, but we felt there was nobody doing that. And so we set the company up 5 years ago. We're now 20 odd people based in Manchester and London. We've worked for just about every bit of the country, lots of private sector companies too, leveraging my experience as a civil servant in the Treasury and in Downing Street and other places, and lots of other former civil servants, and that's what we do.
And before, you mentioned briefly your time at Greater Manchester, in particular your role in drawing up the devolution deal, Devo Manc as it became commonly known. But prior to that, and one of the, I think, underlying reasons why Manchester has enjoyed a degree of success, great success over the past 20, 25 years, is that it's always been able to go to government with asks that have been evidence-based.
Yeah.
And of course, you were responsible for the Manchester Independent Economic Review.
I was.
And I think other cities are beginning to copy and replicate some of that work. But given the fact that we are now in an unprecedented, and that word is well overused, but I think in this case it's justified, an unprecedented situation, I would suggest it's even more important now that cities, places begin to actually collate information, evidence about their localities, because we are in danger, I fear, of having a government that simply provides a blanket that says one size fits all. And in my opinion, Mike, and you can agree or disagree with this, I think each city, each region will actually have its own priorities and will be able to recover in different ways.
Well, I do agree completely with what you said. So yeah, the Manchester Independent Economic Review was something that I very much kicked off and stewarded through, and of course they've just repeated it 10 years on, was it, with the Prosperity Review. I did one just before the crisis broke in Cambridge, working for Cambridgeshire on the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Independent Economic Review, and we've just been engaged, as you know, by your home city, Liverpool. Tony Reeves and his team were working closely with them on a recovery plan, and one of the things that was really brilliant to see early on in that engagement was Tony saying, look, we've got to start by looking at the numbers and what are the numbers telling us about Liverpool, and yet working it up from the bottom up, because particularly in a time of change like this, there's lots of things that you thought you could take for granted that you absolutely can't, and there's lots of things that are new that you never even thought of, and unless they're in your strategy planning space, chances are you're going to hair off in the wrong direction.
And in terms of the the particular priorities at this moment in time for the different places. And I don't necessarily expect you to comment on them all, but you will be aware of the strengths and the weaknesses, perhaps, of those cities that you have worked in before and you're looking at now. So Liverpool, Manchester, from a Northwest perspective, but also like to get your take on Birmingham. And the other just sector to throw into the mix here, Mike, and whether you have a view on this, I'm not sure. But I wasn't aware before we hit this crisis of how important and big the hospitality sector was to the UK. I appreciated it was a large sector. We've got loads of members in the hospitality sector, and it's always been seen as an important underpinning economic activity for cities in particular. But just wondered whether, the specific things that you think we can identify for those three cities I've mentioned, but also any views on the hospitality sector and what it might look like for them post-crisis.
So we've hit on both of those in the work I've done for Liverpool, but even more in, I'd say, on culture. But they all have the same basic problem, which I'll come back to in a sec. And the first thing to say is we're working with somewhere in the south that should probably remain nameless, because it's not my job to broadcast their business. And as it happens, the bit of the economy that they're in has lots and lots of defence contracting. It has lots of stuff for the air industry, for satellites and that sort of thing. They've got gaming speciality as well. And we'd actually just done a piece of work for them before this all broke. And a hypothesis I came up with, which we're testing now, we don't know what the answer is that if you've got an economy like theirs, where effectively the driver of that economy is basically business to business and business to government on big non-consumer services, then a reasonable hypothesis, I think, is that you're probably going to be safer than if you've got an economy that's principally business to consumer and around consumption. Because if the OBR is right and in the first quarter the British economy shrinks by 34%, is I think their base forecast, then bizarrely that means that a third, 2/3 of the economy is still going to be going strong, and that my guess is that the 34 is going to be very, very consumer driven, very interactive, personal services, and that sort of thing. So if I were looking at this in any place, one question I'd be asking, and we're doing the numbers right now, just don't have the results, is whether or not you're really exposed to consumers. And of course, the sectors you've just raised, and I put culture in there too, but hospitality, leisure, tourism, all that stuff is absolutely about consumers. And the problem we've got is it's not the last 3 months, because you can love this government or you can loathe it, but I'd say Rishi Sunak has, admittedly it took him 3 bites at the cherry to get there, but probably 4 or 5 now. He has done more than I would have ever bet any Conservative Chancellor would have done to try and stop the economy going into freefall. And although the numbers are going to look ugly, they're going to look a damn sight better than they would have done had he not done that. The problem's going to come when this unravels. And everything I'm seeing out of government, including some private conversations I'm having, says that we can expect that we're going to get progressive easing, and that social distancing is going to remain. And whether you are running a cruise liner, whether you're a restaurant, a large shop, a theatre, a concert hall, how we are going to affect social distancing in these sectors for what's probably going to be several months and quite possibly a year or two ahead is anybody's guess. And that prospect alone is, I suspect, enough to tip a lot of those sectors out of the sort of the state of suspended animation they've been in, when the life support that's keeping them going is even eased, let alone withdrawn. That could be enough to crystallize some of those into going over the edge. And our challenge is to identify, through the means I've been talking about, to which of those sectors they're particularly vulnerable, and then to make sure that as cities, as local authorities, as towns, as combined authorities, as LEPs, whatever we are, to be making the argument for government that they modify the arrangements they've got in appropriate and timely ways, and not that the Treasury just, frankly, has a collective nervous breakdown, shits itself and takes all the money away, because then we're all screwed, and all the good work that's been done so far will have been wasted.
Yeah. So a longer term strategy, perhaps sector specific, and I'm not, I agree totally that Rishi Sunak's done a good job. But I do think that we potentially now need to, well, not potentially, we do actually need to get into more specifics around those sectors. And we can see, as you've highlighted, Mike, the hospitality, visitor economy culture is going to require a longer term package of support if it's to survive.
Yeah, and we don't know, I'm Jessica and I, as it happens, are trustees of a little orchestra that we set up in Manchester that does early music. We should be having a concert on Saturday. Wild horses wouldn't drag me into St Anne's Church in Manchester on Saturday night. I'm not sure I want to be there any time in the early autumn either. So it's not just what the government does to change restrictions. It's that one of the things that's driven the renaissance of our cities this last 20 years has been that we've all become a little bit like London in one respect, which is that we've all got closer and closer together, cheek by jowl in the way we live, with density driving everything. And of course, that density is what's driven a lot of the creativity of cities. We're in this absolutely bizarre world where the very thing, and this is the sort of irony that art gets off on in life, is that the very thing that has driven the sustainability of our cities this last 20 or 30 years is the very thing that is literally killing people. Because all the data are showing that it's bigger cities and denser places that are being disproportionately hit. That's not just that they're bigger and therefore there's more people getting the virus and dying. It's that it's proportionately hitting denser, bigger places more than smaller ones. And so that means we've all got to really rethink what we're doing. And that's why your point about evidence and strategy is so absolutely spot on.
And if I can just stick with the Chancellor's announcements and those business support packages that he's put together. Again, I think that you will have seen, businesses, particularly SMEs, complaining once more about the slowness of the process, banks not particularly being helpful, other financial institutions dragging their heels, and brought me to the conclusion, Mike, of the fact that the sooner that we can accelerate devolution and get those decisions and those delivery mechanisms at a more localized level, the better. Because actually, when you've got people in charge who are accountable as well as being responsible, then those processes automatically accelerate, because basically their job's quite literally on the line. Whereas when you've got these big institutions, they hide behind bureaucracy. And unfortunately, as I say, we've seen this back in 2008 as well, we're not getting the money out of the door quickly enough.
So I think there's two different points to make on that. I definitely agree with the point you've made about devolution. We're just finishing a huge piece of work for MHCLG, the government department that does local government housing, on resilience and vulnerability. And I did a lot of the case studies for that. And one thing that's crystal clear to me is that, if you want a quick, uniform response, then you do it all nationally and you push it down the stovepipes. It's a military response, command and control. If what you want is a really effective long-term response, you need that devolution. And the truth is you need both. And we've got too much of the former and not enough of the latter. Because, when I heard, I was doing some stuff this morning and listening to the radio, and the BBC journalists are saying, well, in care homes, we don't know what's going on. And what are these local resilience forums? I mean, if we were serious as a country, local resilience forums would be doing what's happening in the land or in Germany, and actually coordinating things. The fact that we've got these things that aren't as embedded in our country as they should be means that they're not as strong as they should be. There isn't enough local leadership, there isn't enough local capacity, and there isn't enough local ability to flex resources to get things done. The second thing, though, that I think is specifically true of the banking sector goes back to the last time we actually sat in a room together, Frank, which is when Jessica and I did this at the Lowry Hotel just 8 weeks ago. And I remember saying that one of my sort of cri de coeur, if you like, was that we needed the public and the private sector to work differently together. We needed the third sector. We needed more creativity. And if only we could, I imagine some future world where we just stop seeing ourselves as being victims of a path-dependent approach. This is how we do things. And I think the one bit of Rishi Sunak's budgets that he's had to have shaken out of him by degrees, I think at the fifth attempt with 100% guarantee, 100% loans for banks without guarantees, he's finally getting there, is this view that this is how we do things. And I did not honestly think 8 weeks ago when we sat together or whenever it was, that we'd have car manufacturers manufacturing ventilators and, you know, people like private white VCs making PPE for the NHS. And I did not actually think that you see Rishi Sunak giving the kind of guarantees that we don't give because there's moral hazard and all the other good economic reasons why in times of plenty you don't let SMEs off the hook. The positive thing to take from this is that all kinds of rules that have bound us, and this is nothing to do with all that EU nonsense and Brexit, you know, the fact that we're living and breathing a crisis day by day in this country means that there's all kinds of rules that we've assumed were unbreakable that we're breaking. And when you can break them in times of war, you can keep breaking the right ones in times of peace. And that's what we should be talking about.
And if I could just stick with the devolution opportunity for a moment, Mike, I do think that I know conversations are happening now between regional mayors and the government about putting some recovery packages together, which are managed at least partially at that localised, regionalised level. And of course, in places like Birmingham, like Liverpool and like Manchester, that infrastructure is well in place now because they've had elected mayors for a number of years and they're good to go. Leeds, a little bit behind the curve. West Yorkshire devolution deal was only just announced during that budget that you referenced there by Rishi Sunak. And then, of course, you've got the big counties. And in the Northwest, that includes Lancashire and Cheshire, which don't have those formal infrastructures in place. So where do you see that leaving those places? Let's start with the cities and the city regions where, as I say, there are mayors in place. What are the sort of things they should be thinking about right now?
Well, I mean, for about the last month, they had to think about doing what they had to do. That people have just been hunkered down, making sure that as few people die as this virus, requires by the fact that it's we don't have a vaccine for it, and that means stopping the NHS falling over, making care homes safer than they clearly have been, etc. And so, I think we're just at the end of a phase where all hands were to the pump. I'd say really smart people, and I know my former colleagues in GM are at it, and Tony Reeves in Liverpool commissioned us to do the work 2 or 3 weeks ago to help Liverpool, and others too. I think those big cities can use their infrastructure and to start to put together recovery plans. And it's not the old Rahm Emanuel quote of not wasting a good crisis. I mean that sounds, in this context, it just sounds wrong. But there is nonetheless an element of truth in it, which is that when there's a crisis, yes, you've got to do what you've got to do in the first phase. But as you get beyond that, you've got to start to think about about what you do next. And I think the big cities you've mentioned are already using their infrastructure to do that. But for those who haven't got a combined authority in a mayor, I give you a different example just to illustrate. When whenever it was, June 1996, the IRA planted that bomb in Manchester that I felt 5 miles away in Chorlton when house hunting. the then Assistant Chief Executive of the Council didn't have a massive team of all the advisors around him. He had some experience from City Challenge. What he did was he picked up the phone that day to Joe Berridge in Toronto and said, get over here because we're going to need some master planning. And to Michael Heseltine, the then Deputy Prime Minister, and said, we're going to have to rebuild the city centre. And to the private sector to say, we're going to need a mayor's relief fund, operational, the ceremonial mayor, operational on Monday, because there's a whole bunch of businesses have just been blown to pieces and ain't going to be reopening. And by some point in that next week, Manchester was open for business again. A package of funding was being put in place. Designs were being drawn up, and all that was from scratch by a really entrepreneurial group of public servants. And that's the answer to the places that don't have combined authorities. Use the opportunity of needing to rethink your place and the fact that your retail economy that was struggling is going to be in deep shit once this is over, and your cultural sector's going to be in trouble, and all your visitor economy and all other services. You've got to do what you've got to do. You've got to stop the clock on to create some time. And I'm open for business, but there's other people too. You've got to get the people round a table and say, right, what are we going to do? Because we've done it before, and it's not just Manchester after the bomb. It was London after their bomb, Manchester after that more recent outrage. It's just about seizing the moment and not letting events completely drag you under, of taking the time and being prepared to spend the money if you need to. You don't always, but if you do, you do, to really decide that you're going to make a stand, and you're going to, as well as dealing with the immediate crisis, once that is under control, you're starting to put in place the team you need to rebuild. And anyone can do that at any scale. It's just going to be appropriate for place.
Okay. We focused on those areas, those sectors that I think are going to face more difficult times going forward. Clearly, what we need for a quicker recovery is to identify those sectors that might be more successful and can help the economy bounce back. So whilst you're looking at Liverpool at this moment in time, are there any particular sectors that stand out there? Wider than that, because you know the country well, you know its economy well, Mike. Where are the sort of sectoral wins that UK PLC may be looking at the moment?
I mean, there's a deep irony in this for those of us who care a lot about the whole Brexit debate, because that shock to the system that we're having is actually preempting the debate that we've been having about Brexit, and would have happened, I think, more largely after the event of the end of transition than is going to be the case. And I hope we'll remain a globally open economy, not just in terms of labour markets. Let's say fruit needs picking, but also in services and in manufacturing too. But I think there's no doubt about it. One of the trends that was there before, it's going to be accelerated, is nearshoring and onshoring. And I suspect that what we're seeing is the thin end of a wedge, which says, we're probably still going to not always going to get most of our cheaper manufactured goods from elsewhere, from the Far East and from China in particular, but actually we need security of supply. So that's going to create opportunities for manufacturing. It's going to reshape logistics. I can see it could change shipping patterns. I can see free ports coming back even more strongly on the agenda. Again, whatever you think of those. I think aspects of business-to-business services will remain strong. I think it's the business-to-consumer services that I think are going to go through a really tough time.
Okay, Mike, we'll come back to you later, because I know we've got some questions from our audience that we want to put to you. But Jess has been sat patiently listening to your words of wisdom. And Jess, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Welcome to the Downtown Den. And Jess, just before we talk about your thoughts, opinions about where we are at the moment, give us a bit about your background.
Yeah, sure. Thanks Frank, and thank you for inviting us to do this. It's brilliant to be here and be able to sort of stop and reflect really on where we are and where we might go next. So I'm the strategy director at Bruntwood. We're a property company across the regional cities, as most people will know, and I'll talk a little bit more about what we do and how we see ourselves in a moment. But I've been there for about 4 years, and before that spent about 10 years working at Manchester City Council on some of the same subjects as Mike, but not all of the same subjects, thinking about future of cities, how Manchester was developing, some of its devolution agenda, and then also the Northern Powerhouse and how the cities across the north and the regions could connect better and make the most of the assets that they had. And before that, I'd spent 15 years in the civil service, mainly working in the Department for Transport, and it was that drove me to go and work in a city. I was fascinated about how we could make decisions in government better than we were doing, because I could see the siloed nature of it and the fact that we were getting stuff wrong from the centre of government, because you couldn't get full visibility of how the pieces of an economy in a place fitted together. And so I went to Manchester as a sort of experiment for maybe 6 months or 2 years, and found myself here more than 10 years later, having done some fascinating things and also working in a property company, which was not on my list of things I ever thought I'd be doing. But it is a quite unusual property company, I guess, and we are a developer, but we also own and manage our buildings long term, which gives us a different kind of perspective, I guess, on the future of the places that we're operating in and the need for them to be successful, for us to be successful, and for our customers to be successful. So we have this kind of rootedness in the cities that we're in, and possibly that's why I'm here talking about place and economy and the future of where we might go, and why Mike and I have such fascinating discussions at home. We also, and I'll come at this conversation from the perspective as being a business that employs over 800 people, a lot of whom are in that kind of customer facing roles, right through to sort of developers and designers in our business. So we have 800 people working at all levels, doing all kinds of different things. And so we're a large employer in the cities we're in. And we also, as a business, just to give you a sort of sense of scale, and I hate doing property by square foot, so I'm not going to do that, we provide space for 3,000 businesses. So we have 3,000 businesses of all different sizes within our spaces, from startups, one-man band, people in co-working space, right through to large corporates who take large amounts of space with us, or who are locating, interestingly, smaller parts of their high-end tech businesses within our spaces. We also have more than 200 retailers and hospitality businesses who are within our portfolio. So, as we've been talking about already this afternoon, very hard hit and very quickly hit through this crisis. So that's kind of who we are as a business. I can talk a little bit, if you think that would be interesting, about how we've seen the last 6 weeks or so.
Yes, please. Yeah, I think that'd be useful.
So, clearly there was the initial. We've been sort of watching this thing emerging, and I was watching it actually through a MIPIM lens, because MIPIM is the property conference that happens in the south of France in the middle of March every year, and I bumped into Howard Bernstein actually on Victoria Station in the middle of February and started talking about MIPIM, and he said, well, that's not going to happen this year. And we started watching, is this going to happen or not? We always take a delegation. I go, and as it approached, I became very clear I didn't want to be in the south of France with 30,000 people from around the world shaking hands and talking to each other in conference space. and it got cancelled the week before we were due to go. So this was kind of, I'd seen it through this lens approaching, but I don't think any of us had quite imagined the shock and the speed with which it would impact on our business and on our life, really. And so we spent, as you'd imagine, the first period as most businesses were, dealing with this kind of huge economic but also societal upheaval, and trying to work out how we kept both those 800 staff that we had safe and kept our customers supported at the same time. And that was a very challenging period, and started through, the hygiene and the practices we had in our buildings, through to supporting businesses as they were needing to work outside the buildings and wanting to close down space, and as we needed to withdraw as many people as we could from our buildings to help them maintain that kind of safety. And we've worked tirelessly with those 3,000 customers to try and support them through this period, and understand what they've needed in order to continue working effectively where they could, or to get the access support from government and other places, including us, where they needed to. But we're sort of moving. We recognised, and in fact, when I worked in the Department for Transport, I did quite a lot of emergency planning work and was involved in the 7/7 bombings on the tube, and foot and mouth disease and petrol crisis and those sorts of things. And you can see the rhythm of these kind of crises. You have to deal with the crisis at the front end, but you start moving into a new normal and then planning for recovery pretty quickly. So you could bring that expertise to bear. And we're starting, we are now firmly in that sort of how are we moving into a recovery phase. And loads of, everyone around this table will have been bombarded with advice from their sector associations, from property industries, from businesses trying to sell to them, through to the Daily Mail. Will all be giving their advice about how we move through and out of this. And we've it can be a bit overwhelming, and so we've taken a bit of time just to say, okay, what does this actually mean for us as a business, and to try and draw through some of the trends as they absolutely apply to us, not to the sector, not to the city, not to anywhere else, but just to our business. And what does that mean? And we've seen a few interesting things around this acceleration of trends that were already happening. I don't think there's going to be a big disjuncture. I think we're going to see things accelerate that were already been in the pipeline. So that sense of flexibility, what's an office for, how are people using space, a move towards cost consciousness. So people are going to need to be thinking, how do we spend less on things like property? The safety and the health and the well-being of employees is coming through really strongly from the businesses that we have as our customers. And then we sort of see, so that's a kind of business context. We also see this sort of employees dynamic being quite interesting, where we're seeing sort of more tuned in and assured employees in a funny kind of way, who are thinking about what they want from life and from work, and how they work productively, with stronger opinions about what that looks like to them. And then a sort of this kind of health anxiety and awareness and sense of, how's this all going to play out, and how do I keep safe, coming through from employees very clearly. And then this sort of sense, and we've all had it, listening to the birds and to nature and all that stuff about, this focus on the fundamentals of life. What is it that really matters to us? And we sort of see those things playing out, and it's quite tempting to say, oh, well, there's a series of trends, how can we respond to that? But actually within them, there are a whole series of tensions. And I think this is where it becomes really interesting, where you have to respond to those things in combination, where they don't sit neatly together. So, I'll give you a couple of examples. One is creating more smart buildings smart technology within buildings, so you don't have to push open doors, they open automatically. You have cleaning regimes in your restrooms that are automated. So all of that kind of smart technology, which seems like it really hits all of that safety of employees, safety of your customers, and yet really is at tension with this cost consciousness and people's willingness to pay right now, and confidence in paying. That's one. Another is around freedom and flexibility that people want in their working lives, and yet as a business needing to be able to plan the space, particularly as we're just coming out of this COVID crisis, so that you're not going to be overwhelmed on one day and have nobody in there the next day. So how are we creating social distancing, but also responding to people's desire to work in a way that they want to work? So that's a couple of sort of thoughts, and it just left me with this kind of, as we went through that process, we all need to be able to do it for our own businesses, taking all of that noise that's out there and kind of creating some focus and concentration on the long term. And I think I just want to finish, if I could, Frank, not letting you get a word in edgeways, which is a bit unusual, or even more unusual, with a sort of couple of points of optimism, really, so that we're seeing from our perspective. So Bruntwood, for those of you who don't know, took a sort of swerve a few years ago into creating space for science and tech businesses and owning science parks. And in amongst that, we did something which half of our business, I'm sure to this day, still think was bonkers, and bought Alderley Park, which was the old AstraZeneca headquarters in the Cheshire countryside. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a while. But we moved into this science and tech space, and I think that there is a real sort of optimistic note in this, which we've seen particularly playing out, but not solely playing out in science and tech businesses, around innovation. And innovation both of products, and Mike stole my example around ventilators, but let me give you another one. Brewdog starting to create hand sanitizer, which they were giving to vulnerable groups instead of brewing beer. So this innovation in products, but also innovation in business models and how business models are working. So, the move to online, but there are other examples of business model change, which I think we'll continue to see. And also some new innovation in partnerships. And really, to Mike's point at the end, that we're seeing some really interesting ways of working that cut through a load of the old, this is going to take 3 years to set up and endless documentation. And the example which many people would have heard this morning on the radio around the NHS using private hospitals in ways that they would have found unimaginable just a month ago, and doctors and surgeons, consultants talking about the way that is freeing up new ways of working and real innovation to the benefit of people needing healthcare. So that's my kind of note for optimism, and I think there's quite a lot to build on there. And in thinking about city recovery rather than business recovery, I think that there are some things which we ought to press on faster than others, and not just kind of keep moving everything forward at the same pace. And that's where I'll leave us at this point.
That was an excellent contribution, Jessica, as always. Thank you. And the risk of allowing Mike to go first. He's always going to pinch your best lines where he can.
Only one.
You used an interesting phrase there when you said we need to accelerate some of the things that we were going to do anyway.
Yeah.
And I think that let me take Bruntwood as a business. Bruntwood has always, I think, been innovative. It's been forward thinking. The way in which it's diversified its activity and its portfolio over the last decade or so, that is clearly in times such as this. Chris Oglesby and his colleagues must be thinking, thank goodness we did that, and we didn't leave all our eggs in the commercial rental space. But the other thing I know Bruntwood are keenly interested in, Jess, and you have a particular responsibility for, is that the places that you are operating in, you care deeply about their economic growth and their well-being, and the fact that you want them to be successful so that Bruntwood can be successful. You quickly reference cities and city growth there. Are there any areas where you think Bruntwood will be looking to work in collaboration with certain sectors to, as you say, get those quick wins in place, I suppose?
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Yes. So, I mean, we've been building this sort of pretty rich set of partnerships with quite a range of different organisations, and some of that is other businesses. So our Science and Tech business, owning the science parks and creating a network of innovation districts, is a joint venture with Legal & General as an investor partner, and relies on partnerships with universities and local authorities and local areas in the places that they're in. So we've sort of been building that kind of rich place partnership. We've always, for a long time, had a history of partnership with local authorities, and earlier in the first quarter of this year, we bought Stretford Mall and Altrincham Stamford Quarter as a JV with Trafford Council, and so we've kind of got some of these partnerships in place. In fact, and you know, some health service partnerships which are pretty interesting. I think these have given us quite a lot of experience about where we can bring our private sector flexibility and commerciality to bear on some really intractable problems. And I think I've been talking to Chris about how we continue to drive that over the next few years. It will be absolutely needed as we start building recovery, and particularly if you think about recovery of our high streets and town centres and those places where people come together and that add vibrancy and life to all our lives. And I think there may be some opportunities in there around different kinds of workspace as well. So if you think about, I'm sat in our kitchen and I don't particularly like home working, but I'm also right now not that keen on getting on the tram and going into Manchester city centre every single day. Now I'll do that sometimes, but would I like somewhere that I could walk down the road or get on my bike and head down the road and sit in a professional environment with great broadband, and where I could have a professional distance from my own home? And are there some hub and spoke models we can start building as a property a company and developer, and that we could invest in that become part of our town centres and high streets? And I think there could be some really interesting opportunities around that. And I think that on a bigger picture, we are trying to support the cities that we're in as they build their recovery plans, and having big employers, big businesses in those places who have skin in the game, as we talked about earlier, really engaging smartly with public sector partners will help, is essential actually as we move forward. And some of that is because we have a voice and can create some influence in central government. We can spot gaps, we can join things together across places in different ways. So I see quite a lot in that. And let me give you another example. Mike talked about local authority delivering faster than the banks. Now, actually, local authorities are getting grants out the door at very variable speeds, partly because they have different amounts of capacity, and also they have different levels of confidence to innovate, I think. So there's some local authorities we know about who are saying, we can't do that because government has said no, and other local authorities are saying, well, we're not going to spend all of this way, so tell us what you need, tell us what this is looking like for your small businesses, and we'll put a package together and promote that to government, which we can jointly, which we can use our industry bodies to also promote. So I think there are some ways that we can work informally and softly, and then there are some big roles that we just ought to be taking in more formal partnerships.
Yeah, it's great points there in terms of how more entrepreneurial public sector agencies will probably get a better bang for the buck out of this. And again, we're involved with conversations at regional level, and it's interesting to see how, and I will take Liverpool as the example here, because we should shout about the city when it's doing the right thing, and it certainly has over grants. I think it's been exceptional in terms of the way it's got the money out of the door. And, the mayor's point of view here, Joe Anderson, was, look, some people might get this money who shouldn't get it, but I'd rather that than delay money to those that are needing it and do qualify. And actually, where there's businesses that have fallen outside of the criteria, let's start to explore ways in which we can help them as well. And I think that's absolutely the way in which we need to go. Final point to you, Jessica, before I open it up to questions, because we've had several. I'm not sure if you're on the chat.
I see the chat, but when I put it up, it covers your face, Frank.
Yeah. And obviously, Jess, you prefer it to cover Mike's, but there's nothing I'm awfully sorry.
You can move it.
Just final point, because I've mentioned that the Bruntwood have innovated, be more diverse in its approach over the last 10 years or so. And listen, we're one of its biggest customers. We've got offices in all the cities we operate in. And one of the first calls I had was from someone from Bruntwood saying, what can we do to help? Which is a fantastic customer service. And of course, it's one that, being a long-term customer of Bruntwood, we've come to expect. There will, though, be those who are in the same space, I'll use the word competitors, who haven't been as diverse, who are now looking at their bottom line thinking, we're in deep shit here. What would your advice be to those sort of businesses, to those companies, as I say, slightly different from the model that you have, but clearly facing some of the same challenges?
I think that would be. I'm not sure how much advice I would give to our competitors. I mean, I suppose if I think about what will see us through this, and to be clear, this is not going to be easy. This is going to be a pretty bumpy road, and we've modelled some pretty, grisly scenarios as we look ahead. I think the thing that will see us through is the focus on having a really clear sense of purpose, what we're about. We're there to support, create great cities that are vibrant and where people do well in them, and that's businesses and the communities that are there. And that's always been part of what we've been about from the time that Michael Oglesby was first, sort of moving into creating, something out of the hollowed out shells that were some of our cities. And so having that clear sense of what we're about, that we keep coming back to, that hasn't all been ditched when this happened. It was it was a clear part of our focus, but also you raised it, really trying to keep close to our customers. Now, we're not going to get that. There are going to be customers who suffer, have a really difficult time through this, and we'll try and do what we can to help that within the bounds of the things that we can do. But keeping really close to our customers and understanding what it is that they need, and having those one-to-one conversations gives us such richness in understanding what they might need as we come through this. And it's not going to be a one day it's all going to be fine. It's going to be a long haul. And how do we prepare to do that? And to kind of, so I think that sort of that understanding of our customer base is just critical. And also the property fundamentals needing to have enough money to pay your interest payments, and so you don't go bump. And so, you know, we're going to sort of being able to cut your cloth around this and be as efficient and productive as you can be through that process, but also doing right by your customers, because it's clear to me, and I don't use our sector necessarily in this, that those businesses that are seen to be doing right now will get real benefit from that, as opposed to those businesses who are, you know, need to be doing wrong. And you know, I think about, for instance, you know, the Starbucks of the world, who are big global corporates who are well capitalized and are not paying the things that they should be paying, who aren't
that means taxes and rents.
Yeah, and who are looking for government support. You know, there's a deal to be had here. There's a deal between employees and employers. There's a deal between the government and businesses. We need each other right now, and we need each other to be part of an economic jigsaw rather than protecting our own small sector of an industry.
Jess, thanks for that. Let's turn to the questions that we've had come through. And Andy Spinoza, who you both know well from SKV Communication, is asking, it's not on here actually, he's texted me this question. I won't read out what he's put on there. So in terms of the conversations that we've been talking about today is about recovery, but of course previously what we've spoken about and the dinner that your project spends. Jess, you were talking about that transport investment that is long overdue. Andy's question is, given the fact that the government have had to invest so much in mitigating against the crisis, do we anticipate that those big infrastructure spends in the Northern Powerhouse, in the Midlands Engine, will continue? And I'll come to you first, Mike.
Well, we don't know is the truth of it. I mean, my hunch is that they simply can't stop them for two reasons. One, because they need economic activity. The problem is the bits of HS2 that are really spending are the bits that aren't in the north. But they'll need to carry on because, you know, bluntly speaking, good old-fashioned Keynesian reflation suggests that capital projects that put lots of people into work are a good thing at a point where the bits of the economy we've talked about suffering are suffering. So I don't think they can pause everything economically. I don't think they can do it politically either, and especially in the north, because just before this trauma was the election in which Boris Johnson was swept into power on a tide of votes that he himself acknowledged were merely lent to him. And if he doesn't do something for the north in the next 4 years, he will be ejected from office and knows that very well. So I think there are good economic and political reasons for thinking that not everything will be paused. There are good fiscal reasons for thinking that the Treasury will want to do so, and that's where the battle's going to be fought. I suspect that not everything that's been talked about happening will happen. Some things that have been talked about that could be happening more quickly will be made to happen more quickly, and some things will be slower. The problem is we don't know which.
Jess?
My sense from some of the more political discussions that I've had reports of are that the levelling up agenda is absolutely still there. That, as Mike said, there will be a swift ejection from office if Boris behaves a bit more like Theresa May. This absolutely they get the need for the recovery not to be even more damaging than it could be to the north and the regions. We have a transport secretary who seems to have the bit between his teeth on getting on and delivering some of this transport infrastructure. Whether that can be delivered, as Mike says, in those sort of Treasury trade-offs is to be seen. My view is that these things, the big infrastructure projects around Northern Powerhouse Rail, HS2, they will happen. It's a timing question, and quite over what time period. And I noticed, and I don't mean to sort of take over your job, Frank, but I noticed on the chat a question about construction sector that came through from Keir, and you know, I think this is really critical that we get, you know, we can get this sector moving. It is a big part of our economic base, and we ought to be giving that, you know, we ought to not leave it in a fragile place. And you know, to be fair, there were the announcements around HS2 going ahead came early in this crisis.
They did.
And continuing to go ahead. It sort of went under the radar because at that moment we were having, you know, horrendous increases in the number of people dying of COVID-19 in hospitals. So it wasn't on the front pages, but you know, those signals I think are very positive. And frankly, once you've spent all this, you know, all this money, it's you know, having some route out of it is pretty important. And I can't imagine the austerity, you know, I cannot envisage an austerity message right now. I mean, if you just stop and think about it for a moment, it's that sort of language and cuts message is really hard to hear coming out of this kind of government.
So can I follow up on that? Because I think that point about construction is right. It's a really interesting conundrum. I mean, look, I'm seeing lots of people in my profession coming out with, you know, methodology saying this is we know what's going to happen. I just think in a number of key ways to go. It's what I said at the beginning. We don't. But you know, one thing we know that happened out of 2008-9, I think we're seeing again, is cash will be king. So if you've got cash, you're holding it, you know, you're in a better place. If you're really, really leveraged, which is why I suspect this could be a good time for Bruntwood, because I think WeWork is going to have a real hard time, and others too. So I think for all those reasons, I think construction is in a good place. The problem is that I have a horrible, I don't know if it's a horrible feeling, a deep feeling that there is something going on around, you know, I don't think we can all have clapped all the NHS workers and care workers all those Thursday nights and then go back to a world of such precarious employment terms for so many people. I think there's a sense that something wasn't right, and I think you see it there in the Starbucks example and the Richard Branson stuff. But I think there's a sense that there's something not quite right now. You know, perhaps optimistically, politically, that's what I might personally want to think. But my sense is that if what we really want is consumer confidence back, and to the key point about construction, what you need to drive buying houses, renting houses, decorating houses is consumer confidence. Then you would need to deal with the very high proportion of the British population who've been on very short-term contracts with, you know, flexible and low numbers of hours for relatively modest rates of pay. That we're going to have to do something that's on the human side of the account as well as on the construction side of the account. So my comment to people who are in property and construction related businesses on this call is, you know, you're going to see some things that are probably going to hit you in your pay packets. Me too, you too, Frank. That you're going to want to think hard before you viscerally reject, because actually what we're going to need is for people who are going to be very badly affected by this crisis to come back with some confidence, some spending power to start to rebuild those town economies, because that's what's really killing town economies. It's a lack of spending power. That's going to be worse again as a result of this. And I think that's one of the many things that hangs in the balance here. So it's not just about capital projects and construction, though it is. It's actually about making sure that there's enough pounds in people's pockets in the towns and cities of this country, because without it, we don't get confidence.
Next question is from Thomas Mornier. Thomas from Fazenda. Great to hear from you, Thomas. Do we imagine the decrease of demand for offices or retail to increase or decrease costs? Less office space to rent may mean the price for the smaller units going up. And if less people have to go to offices because they can work from home, how do you think that will impact on the economy of city centres? Jess, we'll start with you.
Yeah, if I absolutely knew the answers to this, I would be I don't think I would be going to work again. I would have, I'd be backing, I'd be putting on some fairly large bets on things. I mean, look, I think this great working from home experiment has shown what is possible. It's shown the art of the possible, but I don't think it's necessarily shown the art of the desirable. And I think, you know, there are many of us who think, oh, you know what, we could do things a bit differently, but am I going to stop going into a city centre permanently? No, I don't think so. And I don't know many people who are saying they would. Does it mean, also, I think, you know, there are some real challenges from working from home, and particularly the younger people in our teams.
I'm enjoying it. Perhaps my wife's telling me something.
Who share our spaces, who've got shared spaces with their husband sat next door all day, every day, mithering you, who are sharing homes with people they don't like much. So you know, I think that kind of working from home experiment, it's possible but not always desirable. So I think there's going to be a much more mixed economy, and particularly for a while, as we're trying to figure out how to socially distance in an office. I think people will start using offices for different things, because while this is brilliant, we can actually come together in a virtual world. Constant meetings online are extremely tiring, and I've found that a very challenging thing to do. And there are real benefits for collaboration, which after we get through the first phase of being worried about who we're sat close to, I think we will come back to a period where we use space to collaborate. I don't know quite what's going to happen to pounds per square foot in that sense. I can see some businesses wanting to have access to more space in flexible ways, so that they can accommodate more people coming together at various times. I mean, from our perspective, we had an absolutely full portfolio in the city centre. We couldn't, you know, we had lots of people wanting to grow who we couldn't give space, you know, we couldn't find space for. So we're probably in a different position to many, and I think Manchester city centre is probably a different place to many other towns and cities. So I'm not suggesting it's the same everywhere, and individual dynamics of different micro markets will play out differently. So I'm sorry, that's not a very conclusive, your costs are going to go down if you're in a Bruntwood space. What we are clear about is that we want to continue to grow, continue to invest in the things that are important to people, continue to create community within our buildings, and also in a virtual sense, which we've seen happen very effectively.
Mike?
I think this partly answers the point that Kevin Keith's made about whether or not we're going to see agglomeration coming back, that city centre sort of innovative clusters stuff happening. I think no one can predict the future on this. I think there's so many things up for grabs because of the point I made at the outset about how proximity can now literally kill you. I think we'll get used to that. I think we're still in the early phases of this, and I think we'll get used to it. I think it will start to come back. But I have no doubt whatsoever that the advice we'll be giving, and the advice that companies like Bruntwood will be acting on, and the government too, will be about being flexible and fleet of foot to deal with the needs of the situation. You know, we needed to have all those perspex barriers in supermarkets. They were up within 3 or 4 weeks. I will see lots more things like that. You know, what human ingenuity will find ways to fix the problems as they arise. But it's going to be a bumpy old road, I think, and I don't think city centres are going to feel like city centres probably for a couple of years. And the challenge is to keep the model going, to keep there's a phrase I think of using the Liverpool work, to keep the flame of culture burning so that it can burn bright when the circumstances are right. And that's the sort of threat that I think we're facing here. So I think it's going to be a bumpy old road. But I would make one conditional prediction, and it's this. It's that, you know, we know that we were moving, Jessica's absolutely right, we're going to see an accentuation of trends that were already there. We know that we were moving towards a more national view of the world and a less international one. I don't like that, but I think it's a fact. This can only intensify that, not least because of Brexit. We know that secondly, there's less ability to import cheap labour to do the things that we didn't want to do ourselves. And I note that we were charting planes from Romania now, and the Daily Mail celebrating it. But you know, I think there's going to be less ability and, frankly, willingness on the part of people to do that in the future. And thirdly, we know, but not least because of the ventilator and other examples we've seen of how companies have been fleet of foot, and that they have made real marks for themselves, being good companies, delivering real things that our economy and society has needed. All those things point to me in the same direction, which is that an economy that has seen itself boom over time with based on proximity services, on just consumer services, is going to be less important relatively in the future than it has been in the past, recent past, and that companies and economic models that are based on innovation, on adding value, on fundamentally making things that people really need to buy and want to buy and feel that are a part of adding value to their lives are going to be more important. So I think at the margins, in this mix that we don't yet know what it's going to look like, I'd say companies that are really innovating, that are really smart with taking intellectual property to their heart and using that to drive value and selling that not just in the UK but overseas. I think that's going to be something that I'll be looking and hoping to see more of, and perhaps just a little bit less. You know, either less of the service sector we've seen, or that we just pay more for it and value it better. But either of those is probably what's going to happen, I would imagine.
Listen, guys, I know we said we'd be an hour. We've well surpassed the allotted time, but it's been a fascinating conversation as ever. Andy Spinoza wants me to pass on this message to Mike. He's wearing his Manchester City top as he watches. So
I can assure you, it's the closest I'll ever come to wearing one.
As always, great discussion. Thanks very much for your thoughts and opinions. And if there are any questions that we didn't get to, I apologise. But Mike and Jess have agreed to do a couple of live events when we're back up and running. So we'll get you along to those occasions, I'm sure. Hope to see you at some of those events. Been great to have Mike and Jessica in the den today. Thanks, guys, and I'll see you again very soon.
Pleasure. Cheerio.
Thank you.